I stood in front of the house that meant everything to me. That sight, a two-story cottage perched on a hill and surrounded by pine trees, had always warmed my soul, no matter where life took me. Over the years, I had returned to it in my mind hundreds of times. But now, standing here in the flesh, something deep inside told me that this moment would be nothing like I had imagined. You know that feeling you sometimes get when something seems off, but you can't quite put your finger on it? That's exactly how I felt. A premonition, as if something behind those walls was better left undiscovered. But I ignored it. After all, I'd been dreaming about this moment for so long. I knocked on the door, and almost immediately, I heard a familiar voice. Michael. Rachel opened the door, her face lighting up with joy. I hadn't seen her in over 3 years, but she looked almost the same as the day I left. The same clear eyes, blonde hair, and warm smile. I had forgotten how comforting her hugs were, and for a brief moment, I let myself relax as I hugged her back. You're finally home, she whispered, holding me close. Yes, home, I replied, feeling the tension drain from my body. But as soon as I stepped inside, her arms released me, and another voice called out from the living room. Michael, you're back. I turned and saw Tom, my younger brother. He stood in the doorway, holding a glass of wine, looking at me with such happiness that it felt like we hadn't seen each other for a lifetime instead of just 3 years. Tom, I exclaimed in genuine surprise. You're here? Of course, he replied, walking over to give me a brotherly hug. Where else would I be? While you were gone, I've been helping Rachel with the house. You know how hard it's been for her alone. I nodded gratefully, though a strange thought flitted through my mind. Why hadn't he mentioned this in his letters? Dinner was perfect. My entire family gathered around the table. My parents, who had come specifically to welcome me home. Rachel, who had cooked all the dishes I'd been dreaming of for years. And Tom, who kept us entertained with his stories all evening. I smiled, laughed, ate, drank wine, and felt warmth spread through me. But, as you might have guessed, it was all a lie. A carefully staged performance. Sitting at that table, I never once doubted their sincerity. I looked at the faces of my family and thought about how lucky I was. My wife, my parents, my brother. They all seemed so genuinely happy. But the truth was far darker than I could have ever imagined. And you need to hear this story to the end to understand what I went through. After dinner, Rachel led me upstairs to the bedroom. You must be tired, she said, adjusting the covers on the bed. Yeah, it's been a long day, I replied, watching her move around the room. Everything seemed to be in its place. If you need anything, just let me know, okay? She walked over to me, wrapped her arms around my neck, and looked into my eyes. I nodded. Everything's fine. I'm home. She smiled, kissed me, and left, closing the door behind her. I lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, and suddenly that strange feeling crept over me again. The same unease I had felt at the doorstep. It was back. Why can't you just relax? I thought to myself, closing my eyes. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I just didn't know what. The next morning, I woke to sunlight streaming through the thin curtains. Everything seemed so peaceful. The chirping of birds outside, the warm glow on the walls, the smell of coffee drifting in from the kitchen. Stretching in bed, I felt relaxation wash over me in waves. It was all so perfect, as if life had finally decided to repay me for the years I had spent away from home. Descending the stairs, I saw Rachel. She stood at the stove in a short, loosely tied robe, frying eggs. For a moment, I froze, watching her. The sunlight danced in her hair as she hummed a tune to herself. When she noticed me, her smile widened even more. Good morning, soldier, she said, walking over to hug me. Good morning, I replied, pulling her close. This moment felt so real that I almost convinced myself that all my doubts from the night before were just foolishness. Then Tom entered the room. You're up, he exclaimed, sitting down at the table. We were just talking about how you need to take it easy today. His tone was casual, as always, but I suddenly caught myself watching his movements carefully. He seemed far too comfortable here. I frowned slightly but quickly returned to my usual demeanor. You've already discussed this with Rachel? I asked, sitting down at the table. Of course, he said, smiling. We talked a lot while you were gone. His words hit me harder than I expected. I said nothing, but a wave of irritation rose in my chest. The day passed quietly. We took a walk around the property, reminiscing and laughing. Rachel held my hand, and Tom kept cracking jokes, as if trying to prove he belonged in this family. But the more I watched him, the more I was haunted by a strange feeling, as though I was seeing something I hadn't noticed before. My parents left after lunch, leaving the three of us alone. In the evening, Rachel and I stayed in the living room. Tom claimed he was heading to bed early, but I heard him moving around the house. His footsteps were faint, but I was too attuned to such details to miss them. Why are you so tense? Rachel asked as I stared at the staircase. It's just unfamiliar, I lied. She walked over, sat beside me, and rested her head on my shoulder. Everything will be fine, she said softly, and I wanted to believe her. I really did. That night, I couldn't sleep again. I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house breathe. Every creak, every whisper of the wind outside filled me with unease. I kept thinking about how easily everyone had accepted me back, how warmly they had welcomed me. Everything seemed perfect. So why did I feel this growing sense of dread? I got up to get a drink of water and headed downstairs. The faint glow of a light came from the kitchen. I stepped into the room and froze. Rachel was sitting at the table, speaking quietly on the phone. Her voice was muffled, but I could hear every word. He doesn't suspect a thing. Yes, everything is going according to plan. Not yet. We just need a little more time. My head began to spin. I stood in the shadows, unable to move. What was she talking about? Who was she speaking to? Rachel ended the call, stood up, and turned around. When she saw me, she flinched. Michael, you scared me. I did too, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I couldn't sleep. Were you talking to someone? Oh, just a friend, she said, avoiding my gaze. She wanted to check in on you. I stared at her, feeling something tear apart inside me. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to think it was just my paranoia. All right, I'll head back to bed, I said, turning away. She came over and hugged me. Everything's fine, Michael. You're home. It'll all be okay. I nodded, but her words offered no comfort. The next morning, Tom acted as if nothing had happened. Rachel smiled as if everything was perfectly normal. They sat across from me at the breakfast table, and I found myself scrutinizing their every move, their every expression. Michael, you seem distracted, Rachel said, placing a stack of pancakes on my plate. No, everything's fine, I replied, forcing a smile. I already knew they were hiding something. All I could do now was wait, listen, and observe. They thought I wasn't noticing, but I was. And soon, I would find out everything. I couldn't take it anymore. The days spent in my own house, the one that was supposed to be my refuge, had turned into an endless maze of suspicion. What began as small details, glances, words, half-truths, had now grown into an impenetrable wall of mistrust. This time, I didn't lie in the dark trying to convince myself everything was fine. I couldn't afford to wait for the truth to reveal itself. That night, when everyone in the house seemed to be asleep, I got out of bed. Quietly, soundlessly, like I was on a mission, I crept downstairs. The house was dark, save for the faint glow of a nightlight in the living room. As I approached the door to the study, I heard voices, muffled, hushed. Pressing my ear to the door, I began to listen. It's too risky, Tom said. You're overreacting, Rachel replied. Everything is going according to plan. He hasn't suspected a thing. My blood boiled. Those words left no room for doubt. Rachel and Tom were talking about me. They were hiding something. I flung the door open with enough force to make it slam against the wall. Tom and Rachel froze, caught in the act. For a moment, there was dead silence. What's going on here? I demanded, staring them down. My voice was low and threatening. Rachel tried to smile, but her face was pale. Michael, you're scaring me. What are you doing? I'm asking what's going on, I repeated, not moving an inch. Tom was the first to stand, trying to act like nothing was wrong. Relax, brother. We were just discussing some family matters. Family matters? I repeated, stepping forward. The kind I'm not supposed to hear about? Of course not, Tom began, but I cut him off. Don't lie to me, Tom. I've seen you whispering behind my back. I've heard the conversations. What are you hiding from me? Rachel stood, trying to approach me, but I raised my hand to stop her. Michael, you don't understand, she began. Then make me understand, I said, locking eyes with her. She started mumbling something, and Tom tried to take control of the situation. You're overthinking it, he said with a smirk. You've just come home. Everything feels strange. Calm down. Calm down? I felt the rage bubbling over. You're telling me to calm down when I hear my wife saying, everything is going according to plan? What plan? Tell me, Tom. He said nothing. Well, I took another step forward, glaring at him. You've always thought you were the smart one. So, tell me what you're hiding. Rachel tried to intervene again. It's not what you think, Michael. Then what is it? What is it? My voice rose. She hesitated, and I saw panic flash in her eyes. It started when you were gone, she finally said. What started? I demanded, staring into her face, feeling the ground shift beneath my feet. Michael, Tom stepped forward, trying to place himself between Rachel and me. It wasn't easy for her. You were far away. She needed attention. My hands clenched into fists. You're saying you were the one who gave her that attention? I asked coldly. Tom stayed silent. Rachel lowered her gaze. I'm asking you, Tom, did you share a bed with my wife while I was out there serving? Silence. Silence that felt like an eternity. It was a mistake, Rachel whispered. A mistake? I couldn't contain my fury. This went on for 3 years, and you want to call it a mistake? Instead of apologizing or explaining, Tom stepped closer and said, Listen, Michael, you were gone. You don't know what it was like here. We did what we had to do to move on. His words hit me harder than any bullet. Are you serious? I stared at him, feeling a mix of rage and pain well up inside me. You call this moving on? Rachel started crying, but I couldn't even look at her anymore. You knew I'd come back, I said, turning to her. You knew I was fighting to come back to you. And all this time I didn't know what to do, she screamed, cutting me off. You were out there, in another life, and I was here. I looked at her, and every word she spoke only widened the chasm between us. I turned and walked away, leaving them in the living room. On the stairs, I felt tears streaming down my face. But these weren't tears of weakness. They were tears of rage, tears of a man betrayed by the people he loved most. In my room, I sat on the bed, burying my face in my hands. The life I had fought to preserve, the life I had endured so much for, now felt hollow. But I wasn't going to give up. They thought it was over, that I would just leave or accept it as my fate. But I'm not the kind of man who forgives betrayal, and they would soon find that out. I woke early in the morning, but the exhaustion didn't leave me. Even deep sleep couldn't erase the memories of last night. Every word Rachel and Tom had said replayed in my head over and over, like a broken record. But that wasn't what haunted me most. What they had done was a betrayal I could barely recover from. But where were my parents in all of this? Why hadn't they said anything? It all felt like my family knew more than I had imagined. Breakfast was tense and awkward, a silence hanging over us like a thick fog. Rachel and Tom announced they had errands to run. Don't get too bored, Michael, Rachel said, hugging me. I stood still, letting her feigned warmth pass over me like a breeze I could no longer feel. Tom, as always, was smiling, confident that I wouldn't do anything. We won't be long, he said. Take it easy, brother. I nodded, but inside, anger simmered. They had no idea their game was nearing its end. As soon as their car disappeared down the road, I headed upstairs. My parents had left their bag in the guest room, as they always did when they visited. I stood there for a long time, staring at it before making my decision. Inside, nothing caught my attention at first, just clothes and toiletries, until I found my father's tablet. He hadn't set a password, a habit I had always warned him against. I turned it on and opened his email. What I saw chilled me to the core. Rachel's right. He won't find out. We have to support them for the sake of the family. Tom did what needed to be done while Michael was away. I reread the message again and again, struggling to process its meaning. They knew. All this time, they had known. My father, my mother. They were aware of what was happening and did nothing. Worse, they had taken their side. Another email from my mother was addressed to Rachel. Dear, if Michael starts asking questions, just stay calm. Tom has always been strong, and you'll get through this too. We're on your side. My hand trembled. I closed the tablet and put it back in the bag. They had betrayed me. All of them. I stepped outside to clear my head, but the air felt as heavy as my thoughts. Standing on the porch, staring at the horizon, I tried to figure out what to do next. Everything I thought was mine had been destroyed. The family I loved wasn't what it seemed. But if they had chosen to betray me, I would answer them in kind. Returning to the house, I went to the basement, where I kept my old army belongings. Among them were my tools, notebooks, and a few souvenirs I'd brought back from my service. All this time, I had been a soldier, trained to act, not sit idly by. I opened a notebook and started writing. 1. Rachel, block access to our financial accounts. She's used to living in comfort, but that's about to change. 2. Tom, find leverage. His job relies on his reputation, and I know how to destroy it. 3. Parents, force them to confess everything they've been hiding. I knew this would be a long process, but I was ready. The first step was convincing them I'd accepted the situation. I started small. At dinner, I acted calm, as if nothing had happened. You're looking better, Michael, Rachel remarked, pouring me some wine. Just trying to adjust, I replied with a slight smile. Tom, sitting across from me, added, That's good. We all want you to feel at home. I nodded, masking my rage with indifference. They thought I was broken, but that couldn't be further from the truth. Late that night, I returned to the study where my father's tablet was kept. I opened it again and took screenshots of every email that could be used as evidence. Every word, every phrase was now in my possession. Then, I found Rachel's messages where she discussed our finances with Tom. She had already tried transferring some money to her account. Clever, I muttered, but not clever enough. I opened my laptop and changed the settings on our joint account. Now, she couldn't access the funds without my authorization. Let her feel her comfortable world start to crumble. The next day, I visited Tom's office under the pretense of wanting to meet his boss. During our conversation, I subtly brought up a few details from Tom's past that might raise some eyebrows. His boss seemed puzzled but didn't press further. Just a concerned brother, I said with a smile before leaving. Now, it was a matter of waiting. My parents were the most challenging part of the plan. I didn't want to hurt them, but they had chosen a side. Now they needed to understand the consequences of that choice. I called my mother and invited her to visit. We need to talk, I said calmly. She agreed without asking questions. When they arrived, I would make them tell me everything. And then, the pieces would finally start falling into place. They thought they had everything under control, that I would forgive, forget, or eventually resign myself to the situation. But the essence of revenge isn't its speed, it's its inevitability. With each passing day, I watched their lives begin to crack, their confidence turn to fear, their pride dissolve into shame. This wasn't instant destruction. It was a slow, methodical reckoning. Rachel's life started to crumble the very next morning when she realized her usual comforts were no longer accessible. I overheard her on the phone with the bank, her tone shifting from irritation to desperation. There's been a mistake. You don't understand. I need to pay this bill immediately. Her voice grew louder, but I knew no one on the other end could help her. All she could do was face her new reality. For the first few days, she tried to maintain appearances. She started cooking at home instead of ordering takeout. Her regular spa visits ceased. I watched as she nervously flipped through her contact book, searching for someone who could lend her money or offer her a job. But this was only the beginning. A few weeks later, Rachel began selling her possessions. At first, it was small things. Old jewelry, expensive dresses she no longer wore. Then it escalated to more significant items. Her designer handbag, the ring I'd given her for our anniversary, and finally, her car. Michael, I can't do this anymore, she said one evening, her voice trembling. We need to talk. I looked up from the newspaper. About what? You know what? Why are you doing this? Why? I repeated, setting the paper aside. Do you really want to hear the answer? She remained silent, but I saw the fear in her eyes. She understood there was no going back to her old life. Tom held out the longest. His pride and arrogance wouldn't let him admit his world was falling apart. But his downfall was the loudest. A week after I sent the incriminating evidence to his employer, an internal investigation began. Tom grew irritable and anxious. He no longer smiled at dinner, and his phone calls became longer and more heated. It's just a misunderstanding, he repeated. They can't prove anything. But they did. When he was fired, he came home late one evening, his footsteps heavy as he climbed the stairs. He dropped his briefcase on the floor and slumped onto the couch. Those bastards didn't even give me a chance to explain, he muttered. I sat across from him, watching. Are you sure it's only their fault? I asked. He glared at me, his expression both angry and defeated. What are you talking about? Maybe you brought this on yourself. He said nothing, but I could see my words hit him where it hurt. In the following weeks, I learned he tried to find another job. I ensured rumors about his dishonest practices spread faster than his resume. Tom started drinking. His binges grew longer, and his attempts to pull himself out became increasingly desperate. One evening, I found him in the garage. He was sitting on the floor, leaning against the wall, a bottle of whiskey empty in his hand. You knew this would happen, didn't you? He muttered, not even looking up. I crouched down beside him. I did, Tom. And you earned it. My parents were the hardest part of my plan. They hadn't been active participants in the betrayal, but their silence made them complicit. When they arrived at my invitation, I greeted them at the door with an icy calmness. We need to talk, I said, motioning to the living room. They sat across from me, their faces etched with worry. Michael, what's going on? My mother asked. What's going on is that you chose a side, I replied, looking her in the eye. She froze. You're talking about Tom and Rachel. You knew. All this time. You knew they betrayed me and said nothing. We didn't want to, my mother began, but I cut her off. Didn't want to what? Upset them? Lose your convenience? Or maybe you didn't want to lose your perfect family. My father sighed, lowering his gaze. We thought things would work themselves out, Michael. We thought if you never found out, everyone could be happy. I laughed, but there was no joy in it. Happy? You destroyed everything. You chose them. My mother began to cry, but I felt no pity. You've lost me, I said, standing. I hope they were worth it. After that meeting, I stopped answering their calls. They tried to reach me through friends, left letters at my door, but I remained steadfast. Their punishment was the realization that they had lost their son. Rachel was left with nothing. She moved out a few months later, unable to bear the constant pressure. Her life, built on comfort, collapsed, and she had to start from scratch. Tom became a pariah. His career was destroyed, his friends abandoned him, and alcohol became his only solace. My parents lost everything they had tried to preserve. Their dream of a united family turned into a nightmare in which I was no longer a part. And me? I stood by the window, watching the sunset, feeling an odd sense of calm. It wasn't happiness. It was liberation. And in that, I found my victory.